The last letter ever written from the city of Ugarit was found sealed in a clay jar, mid-fire, never sent. The messenger never left. The city never recovered. Within 60 days of that letter being written, a civilization that had operated continuously for 800 years was gone. Not conquered, not absorbed, not migrated. Gone. That was 1177 BCE. It was not the first time. A British surveyor filed a report in 1847 describing a stone road in central Burma, granite blocks, 11 feet wide, mathematically straight for at least 40 miles. The jungle above it was 400 years old. The road was older. It connected nothing on any map. The report is in the British Library right now. File number IOR F42281. No follow-up expedition was ever commissioned. In 179 years, nobody went back. I found that file while researching something else. And once I found it, I found the pattern underneath it. At least 3 times in human history, with physical, verifiable, publicly accessible evidence, a civilization running at a level of complexity we still cannot fully explain simply stopped, not declined, stopped, and the people who came after had no memory of what came before. None. They built temples on top of foundations they could not identify. They called the builders gods because no other explanation fit. Mohenjo-Daro, northwestern Pakistan, excavated beginning in 1920. The city held an estimated 40,000 people at its peak. That number alone is not the anomaly. Rome eventually held 1 million. The anomaly is the infrastructure. The drainage system at Mohenjo-Daro was covered, sloped at calculated angles to guarantee flow, and interrupted at regular intervals by inspection shafts, access shafts, for maintenance workers to enter and clear blockages. In a city that was functioning roughly 3,700 years ago, the municipal sanitation engineering of Mohenjo-Daro was more systematically designed than the sanitation infrastructure of London in 1850 CE. That is not rhetoric. That is what the archaeological record shows when you put the two systems side by side. London in 1850 was still dumping directly into the Thames. Mohenjo-Daro had covered, sloped, inspected drainage in 1700 BCE. The Harappan civilization covered 1.5 million square kilometers, roughly the land area of Western Europe, and operated for somewhere between 700 and 1,000 years. It had standardized weights and measures. The EU. Same bronze weights appear at sites separated by hundreds of miles, implying either a unified trade network or a central administrative system coordinating it. It had writing. Over 4,000 inscribed objects survive, and that writing, the Indus script, has never been deciphered. Not partially, not tentatively, not at all. Every linguistic tool available, including computational analysis, has failed to crack it. The script vanished with the civilization. No bilingual key has ever surfaced. What the Harappan people were saying to each other is permanently silent. The standard explanation for the Harappan collapse is climate disruption, specifically a weakening of the monsoon cycle around 2000 BCE, possibly combined with tectonic shifts that altered river courses. That explanation is plausible. What it does not explain is the stratigraphic profile at Mohenjo-Daro. Below a specific layer, functioning urban civilization. Above that layer, a much simpler occupation by people who were not maintaining what they had inherited. They were not rebuilding the drainage shafts. They were not keeping the inspection access points clear. They were camping in the ruins of a system they held no blueprint for. The maintenance knowledge did not transfer. In a slow decline, it transfers. In a reset, it does not. The second reset is harder to dismiss because the textual record survives from inside it. The Late Bronze Age collapse. The date range is approximately 1200 to 1150 BCE. In that 50-year window, 50 years, which is one career, one generation of leadership, virtually every major palace economy in the Eastern Mediterranean disintegrated simultaneously. The Hittite Empire, which had held its own against Egypt for 6 centuries, vanished so completely that its existence was unknown to modern historians until cuneiform tablets were found at its capital, Hattusa, in the early 20th century. 6 centuries of empire, unknown, until 1906. Mycenaean Greece collapsed. Cyprus was sacked. The trading city of Ugarit was burned and never rebuilt. Archaeologists excavating Ras Shamra, where Ugarit stood, found a destruction layer and then nothing. No resettlement, no successor city. just the burn layer and silence above it. The trade networks that had operated continuously for centuries, moving copper from Cyprus, tin from Afghanistan, grain from Egypt, luxury goods across a Mediterranean-wide supply chain, all of it ceased within a single human lifetime. Iron, too, replaced bronze in this period not because iron is the superior metal, it is not in its unworked form, but because the tin-bronze supply chains were permanently severed and nobody remembered where all the pieces had been. The knowledge of who held the tin, who smelted it, who shipped it, and to whom, that operational knowledge was embedded in the palace administrations that no longer existed. When the palaces fell, the supply chain became unreadable. The successor cultures switched to the inferior metal because the superior one was now a mystery. Egyptian sources from the reign of Ramesses III, around 1177 BCE, describe what they call the Sea Peoples, a term for migrants moving by sea across the entire Mediterranean simultaneously. The inscription at Medinet Habu, the mortuary temple in Luxor, describes nations being capsized like ships, entire peoples pressing forward, burning what was behind them. This is not a description of a raid. It reads like a description of a population. Cascade. People fleeing something large enough that they preferred to burn their past, then return to it. What triggered the initial displacement is the most actively debated question in ancient history right now. The academic literature runs to thousands of papers and produces no consensus. What is not debated is that literacy rates collapsed across the region in the aftermath. Writing disappeared from entire cultures. The knowledge that had been written down disappeared when the writers did. Now move from the eastern Mediterranean to the western hemisphere. Sacsayhuaman, above Cusco in Peru. The largest individual stones in the complex weigh approximately 125 tons. They are fitted together using a technique called anathyrosis, polished contact edges, recessed center faces, designed so that pressure distributes across the entire surface of the joint rather than concentrating at any single point. No mortar. The precision of the fit means the joints are self-reinforcing under load. This same technique appears at Baalbek in Lebanon, at sites in ancient Egypt, and at sites in ancient Greece. Anathyrosis is a specific, sophisticated solution to a specific structural engineering problem. Its appearance on multiple continents in the pre-contact period is not supposed to be possible under the current model of ancient history, which requires these traditions to have developed independently. The independent development of the same specific solution to the same specific problem, at the same level of precision, has never been formally examined in the published literature. The comparison is consistently noted. The examination is consistently deferred. Baalbek, Lebanon. The foundation platform of the Roman Temple of Jupiter was already there when the Romans arrived. The Romans, who were not modest builders, who regularly moved stones in the 20 to 50-ton range for their own projects, built on top of the existing foundation because it was structurally superior to anything they would have constructed themselves. The three largest stones in that foundation are called the trilithon. Each weighs between 800 and 1,000 tons. They are fitted without mortar. The joint tolerance, measured by a stonemason in 2014, is, in places, less than half a millimeter across a stone face 19 meters long and 4 meters tall. No Roman text claims credit for those stones. Not one. The Romans built on top of them as though they were simply the ground. And then Puma Punku, in Bolivia, at an altitude of 3,125 meters above sea level. The site contains H-shaped blocks carved from andesite, one of the hardest natural stones, with internal right angles and precision channels that a machinist, examining them for the first time in 2001, described in Discover magazine as having the geometry of milled components. He was not making a mystical claim. He was making a technical observation. The internal angles are accurate to within fractions of a degree across their full length. The civilization that built it, the Tiwanaku, left no written record of the techniques used. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they recorded Inca oral tradition stating that Puma Punku was already ancient when the Inca themselves arrived. The Inca, themselves accomplished builders of monumental stone architecture, did not know who built it. They attributed it to Viracocha, the creator deity, because their own traditions offered no other answer. The question that the physical record forces into focus is not whether these collapses happened. The Harappan collapse and the Bronze Age collapse are empirically solid. They are in the mainstream academic literature. They are not contested events. They are as established as the fall of Rome. The question is the mechanism. What causes a civilization to stop so completely that the knowledge doesn't transfer? Not just the political administration. The knowledge, the technique, the script. Archaeologist Joseph Tainter, in his 1988 study, The Collapse of Complex Societies, described something he called a complexity threshold. The argument is structural. As a civilization grows more sophisticated, the cost of maintaining that sophistication increases. More coordination, more specialized labor, more redundant systems. And at some point, the marginal return on that investment declines. The civilization is spending more and more resources simply sustaining itself, and any external stress pushes it past the point where maintenance cost exceeds available resources. Below the threshold, the system is resilient. At the threshold, a relatively small perturbation triggers total failure. Tainter's model is not a slow decline model. It is a threshold model. And the threshold is invisible until the system is already past it. The scribe who learned the Indus script from a master, going back 30 generations, that scribe does not carry the knowledge out of the city when the city burns. The knowledge was embedded in the infrastructure that sustained the city. When the city stops, the knowledge stops. The drainage shafts fill with sediment. The access points close over. The road in Burma disappears under 400 years of jungle. The archive offers no resolution on the Baalbek Foundation builders. The paper trail on the Indus script is not cold. It is frozen. There is no further layer to excavate. The builders of the Puma Punku channels are nameless in every document that has ever been found. These are not failures of investigation. They are failures of survival. The evidence did not make it through the gap in a form that lets us reconstruct who was there. What survived is only the evidence that the gap exists. His name was Eshuara. He was the governor of Alashia, the island we now call Cyprus, and based on the administrative correspondence that survives, he had held the position for at least a decade before the end. He was not a peripheral figure. He was coordinating trade and diplomacy across one of the most active maritime zones in the ancient world, writing to kings, receiving shipments, managing the copper exports that made Cyprus the critical node of an entire Mediterranean supply chain. The word copper, in fact, derives from the Latin cuprum, from Cyprus. The island was the supply. Eshuara managed it. Sometime in the last months of the 13th century BCE, Eshuara wrote a letter to the king of Ugarit. The letter was put into a clay jar and placed in a kiln to be fired for transport, standard practice for official correspondence, since fired clay is more durable than unfired. The messenger never left. The city was attacked and burned before the letter could be dispatched. The jar sat in the ruins of Ugarit's kiln for 3,000 years. A French archaeologist lifted it out of the ground in 1973. It is currently in the National Museum of Damascus. The letter describes enemy ships, a fleet already sighted off the Uain coast. Eshuara asks for urgent military assistance. He describes the situation as very serious. Those are the translator's words for the Ugaritic phrase, very serious. He sealed the letter and gave it to a messenger, and the messenger stood in a city that had perhaps weeks left. The king of Ugarit was simultaneously receiving other letters describing attacks from other directions. He was already managing his own collapse. The assistance Eshuara was requesting was not coming because the people it would come from were themselves being swept away by the same force Eshuara was describing. Within 60 days of that letter being fired in the kiln, both Ugarit and the Cypriot trading network it connected to were functionally gone. The copper trade that had sustained the entire Bronze Age Mediterranean, the trade that had made Eshuara's position relevant, that had made the palace at Ugarit worth building, that had made the trilithon at Baalbek worth erecting as a foundation for something even larger. That trade simply stopped. The ships stopped sailing. The tin stopped moving. The scribes stopped writing. The knowledge of how all of it connected stopped with them. Eshuara was approximately 50 years old based on the span of his documented correspondence. He had presumably watched the world he administered function smoothly for most of his adult life. The letter he wrote in those final weeks was not panicked in tone. It was administrative. He was doing his job. He was filing. the correct report to the correct authority requesting the correct response through the correct channel, and the correct channel had already collapsed. He was corresponding with a system that no longer existed in the final moments before he knew it. Geologist Walter Alvarez, not the physicist, a different man, contributed a paper in 2017 to a volume on historical discontinuities in which he noted that the sedimentary record of human civilization looks less like a gradual accumulation and more like a series of distinct layers separated by what geologists call unconformities. Unconformities are gaps, places where the record jumps, layers that should be continuous but are missing. He was speaking metaphorically about cultural history, but the metaphor is precise. Below the unconformity, one world. Above it, a different world with no memory of the first. The question the evidence leaves open is not whether these resets occurred. It is whether the mechanism was always external, drought, invasion, cascading systems failure, or whether complexity itself has an internal ceiling. Whether a civilization operating at sufficient sophistication eventually reaches a point where the knowledge required to sustain it is so embedded in the system that the system and the knowledge are the same object, and when the system collapses, the knowledge is not lost. It is erased, because it was never separate from the thing that ended. The drainage shafts at Mohenjo-Daro filled with sediment over centuries of disuse. The people living above them did not know what they were walking over. They were not incurious. They were simply on the wrong side of the gap, with no document, no teacher, no tradition connecting them to what had been there. The access points closed over. The road in Burma disappeared under 400 years of canopy. Somewhere in the India office records, file IOR F42281 sits on a shelf next to 10,000 other unresolved reports, in a building you can visit, containing a description of something no one has gone back to find.